Okay, hello. So this hopefully short video is for LLB students at AUT who are thinking of or trying to plan their electives for next year and have come across this course that I'm teaching next year called Democracy, Law and Political Conflict, and are wondering what the heck that course is all about. So if that isn't you, no point in watching this video. If it is you, I hope to give you some information about the nature of the course, because it's to help you make up your mind about whether you want to take it or not. I'm teaching this course for the first time next year. I'm quite excited about what it is, but I'll see if you are by the end of this video. Okay, so we live at this won't be news to you, we live at a time of significant political conflict. If you just think about both in this country, in New Zealand, and outside the country, the political conflicts in the societies in which we live are pretty significant. I mean, think, for example, about the conflict that's currently being had over the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand, or, say, trans issues in sport, or inequality, or climate change, or if you're thinking especially outside this country, what about sort of immigration, for example? Think about the riots that occurred in the United Kingdom pretty recently, or abortion. And then one might think about the issue as that's presented in the United States in recent years. Now, this course is not about those issues themselves, right? So it's not about what we should think about the treaty. It's not about what we should think about trans issues in sport. It's not about what we should think of inequality. Those are, and so on. Those are all perfectly valid topics to have a course on, but that's not what this course is about. This course is about what we do about the fact that we disagree about these things. So given that there is a lot of disagreement about the treaty in New Zealand, what should we do about that? Given that there are lots of disagreement about what we should do about climate change, what should we do about that? Okay, so that's what the course is about. How do we manage political conflict? And that's why there's a focus specifically on the democratic societies, not on other societies, because the political conflict tends to get managed in a certain way, or it poses certain problems in democracies, and that political conflict will play out in different ways in other societies. So, for example, in societies that are just strict monarchies or dictatorships or whatever, political conflict will play out in a different way. So the way that political conflict plays out, say, just to take an obvious example, in this country today is very different than the way political conflict played out in Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union or whatever. All right, so hence the focus on democracies. We're looking at democracies because we are one, right? We have one. And the way that political conflict plays out in these societies is different than the way it plays out in other societies. Okay, now, one of the things that's motivating the course, one of the reasons why I want to teach it and why I'm quite excited about the course, is because I think we are losing the ability to deal with political conflict well. We deal with political conflict worse and worse and worse as time goes on. And one might think clearly here about the United States. Just the other day I saw a newspaper report saying that 25% of Americans believe that a civil war will occur after the next election, which is happening, as I record this, in a couple of weeks. Now, I think it's not all that likely for there to be a civil war, for reasons I will actually explain in the course. And I don't really think 25% of Americans really believe there'll be a civil war. I mean, they may think there'll be political violence, and there may well be. But that's still an amazing thing for people to say, right? It's amazing that people think that a civil war in a modern Western country is actually possible. I mean, it's extraordinary that political conflict has got to that level. Now, political conflict hasn't got to anything like that level in this country, but there have been threats of violence. And there are people worried about the increasing possibility of violence, violent political conflict in this country, and we mustn't be complacent about this. It could well be that just give us 10 years and we'll catch up to the United States in this regard. And the part of the point of the course is to give us the tools to enable us to avoid this path. Now, when I first started thinking about teaching this course, I thought, could I really teach a course that deals with issues like the Treaty of Waitangi and trans issues in sport and inequality and climate change? Could I really do that? And there were two problems that really stood in the way. One was, there's been lots of surveys done on this now. I think the evidence is incontrovertible that people just don't feel comfortable about talking about those issues publicly. People might talk about that with their friends, but they're not going to talk about those issues publicly. And it's very clear that students in particular, well, there's only one group of people in society that are more reluctant to talk about those issues than students, and that is academics. So there's a problem there. Right? Another problem is with these issues, people tend to be quite emotionally involved, understandably, right? Quite emotionally involved with them. And because of that, it's quite hard to get people to focus on these issues at the level that I want them to focus on. What I mean by that is, let's say we're talking about climate change, right? The tendency is for people to want to talk about climate change rather than to talk about what I want to talk about in the course, which is how to deal with the fact that we disagree about how to respond to climate change. Right, so because people understandably feel strongly about these issues, the tendency is to want to debate the issues rather than debate how we should deal with conflict about those issues. So I thought about how to deal with this. How am I going to deal with this? And what I've come up with is this strategy. What we're going to do in the course is we're going to look at some historical examples of conflicts where we're not as close to them, right? We're more distant from them. We're going to look at one conflict that occurred 2,500 years ago. Right, we're going to look at political conflicts from the past in history. Now, this isn't a course on history, right? It's not a history course. The point of looking at these historical examples is not to do history for its own sake, and nor will you have to write history essays, right, in this course. The point of looking at the historical examples is to figure out whether we can learn anything from them relevant to today. And of course, I've chosen the examples that I have because I think the answer is that we can learn important things from these historical examples that are relevant to today, that will help us deal with the issues that we're facing today. So I've got three examples. We may talk about more. I'm thinking about also talking about Nazi Germany and that is the collapse of the Weimar Republic in Germany and the rise of the Soviet Union in Russia. We probably won't get time for that. But the three examples that I'm going to talk about are Athens, ancient Athens. This is at about the 5th century BC. What happened, just to give you a very quick rundown of what happens in these historical examples, is they just fought and lost a war, and in response to their losing the war, they replaced their democracy with a tyranny that's called so-called 30 tyrants, who conducted a terror campaign against the populace of Athens. And the really important thing about this historical example is that in response to these terrible events, a thinker came along and presented an idea about how to structure society so that these horrible things wouldn't happen anymore. And that thinker was a guy called Plato, and he produced a really important idea, the idea of the philosopher kings, that is very, very influential today. Even if you've never heard of this idea, it's very influential today. It affects the way lots of people think about political conflict. And we need to look at this idea. It's very important. It's not an idea that I agree with at all, but it's a very important idea because it is increasingly important. It's increasingly influential. It is more and more reflected in the way people today think about political issues. So that's one historical example. The second historical example that we'll look at is the English Civil, or the build-up to the English Civil War, where there were conflicts within English society about a number of things, but particularly over religion and politics. And we're going to look at why it was that they were unable to deal with that conflict and why the conflict collapsed into civil war. And one of the really important reasons for doing this is that conflict, 17th and 17th century England, provides the backdrop for two other political thinkers that we're going to examine, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. And they really provide the two most important alternative understandings of politics to the one presented by Plato in ancient Athens. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what happened and why it was that Hobbes thought that the solution to the problems is the solution that he had, and why Locke thought the solution was the solution that he came up with. And as I say, these three views are very, very important. What you'll see is it's not just these, old, long dead guys who have these views. You'll see that actually, people still think these ways today, right? And so we'll talk about them, and we'll talk about whether they are able to solve conflicts, whether they are useful in dealing with today's conflicts. The third example that we'll talk about is the build-up to the Civil War in the United States in the 19th century. So the amazing thing happened with respect to the American Civil War. In the 1830s, it was very common for people who owned slaves in the South to accept that slavery was immoral. Believe it or not, it's true. Plenty of people accepted that slavery was immoral and accepted that slavery would eventually die out and that it was a good thing that it was going to die out. And yet 30 years later, they were prepared to go to war, to die, to defend slavery. What happened? Right? What happened in this 30 years that turned what looked like a genuine political conflict, but it looked like one that could be resolved? What turned it into a conflict that could only be resolved by war? What happened there? And we'll look at that because, I think we're falling into the same traps as they fell into 200 years ago. But also it's very interesting for us as lawyers because there was a concerted attempt to solve these problems through law, to solve these problems via the Constitution and via the courts. There was a very clear attempt to do that, and it utterly failed. In fact, not only did it fail, it made things worse. Right, the attempt to solve these things in a legal way, to solve these political conflicts in a legal way, made things worse, much worse. And so we're going to look at that and work out why it made things worse. And then, of course, as we always going to do, we're going to ask, what can we learn from that? Okay. Now, as I hope that sounds interesting. Like some of you may be just completely turned off by the fact that we're going to look at historical examples. But remember, it's not a course on history, right? You're not going to be asked to write anything on history. You're going to be asked to write about today. You're going to be asked to write about the theories that we look at, and you're going to be asked to apply them to today's issues. Right? We're going to look at the history because it's something that I think we can learn from, right? Rather than because we're historians. Anyway, so I hope that sounds of some interest to you. I'd love to see you in class, and all the best. Have a good summer.